Hi students. Today we are looking at Is Everyone Really Equal? And we will be discussing chapter 10, which starts on page 154 if you have a print copy, Understanding Intersectionality Through Classism. And the little introduction for this chapter reads, this chapter examines class oppression. We explain current economic relations of power, address concepts such as capitalism and socialism, wealth and income, as well as provide common class vernacular. The chapter also addresses the concept of intersectionality as an important theoretical development for understanding the multidimensional nature of oppression. We identify elements of class privilege, name common misconceptions about class mobility, and speak back to dominant classist narratives. So the chapter starts off with vocabulary, as usual, that you should practice using. Classism, class vernacular, capitalism, social capital, net worth, intersectional and intersectionality, and finally meritocracy. And as usual, this book likes to have a story at the beginning to kind of grab your attention as a reader. And the story is called Mr. Rich White and Mr. Poor White Strike a Bargain. And there's a little footnote that says that the parable is adapted from Lillian Smith's Mr. Rich White and Mr. Poor White Strike a Bargain in her book, Killers of the Dream from 1949. And so the chapter right away gets to talking about how even though there are white individuals who feel disadvantaged, and usually it's a class disadvantage, that there is still white privilege happening, and the parable is going to explain how that occurs, even though it might not feel like it. So that's the beginning. And then very quickly, and I have a lot of notes in this chapter, the authors start discussing what terms they're using and what they all mean. For instance, the first section of content is what is class, and the very first sentence explains that social class is a social construction. So it doesn't really exist. They take you pretty far back, period-wise, in terms of a historical structure of understanding class. You have the agricultural revolution that is mentioned, as well as Karl Marx and his theories, which were also discussed in our larger textbook, Social Justice. So hopefully you will be seeing some connection points you can make between the two textbooks. They explain some of the terms that Marx used, such as the proletariat and the bourgeoisie class. And then they go on to describe minimum wage. And then they relate all of that back. There's a lot of data and numbers in that portion on page 157. And then they relate some of those numbers and facts back to the Mr. Rich White parable. Like, how does it all connect? They also do a lot of examining between U.S. and Canadian income polarizations, mainly because the authors, some of them, or at least one of them for sure, is Canadian. So they're doing some collaborations to give you information across countries so you can understand that what they're talking about with some of these income and wage gaps are not limited to us here in the US. And you have a really great chart here, a table, and it's on page 159, and it references Norway, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, and the United States. So you could see how much a CEO could be making versus how much the average worker is compensated. So understanding kind of like a structural class pyramid. And then, of course, they have bullet points with additional data included on that page 159, as I mentioned. On page 160, they talk about the economics of class, being rich or being poor, and how much money each of us has or earns. They explain that this is an important element to understand social class and income distribution. However, income is not the only element that affects or forms class positions. Class is perhaps primarily about political power, the ability to influence policy, control capital, and shape institutional structures. So they want you to understand class and classism beyond this micro level of how much one individual makes versus another individual. And they give you an example again within Canadian versus US government salaries. So they're trying to get you to understand the similarities across countries. And then they talk about the Occupy Wall Street movement that occurred. And you might have remembered this about the 1% that has the power and the 99% fighting for it back. Class and classism is described on the bottom of page 160. Class is related to social rank in terms of income, wealth, status, and or power. Classism is the systematic oppression of poor and working people by those who control necessary jobs and resources. And classism, they also say, is held in place by a system of beliefs that ranks people according to their economic status and their level of education. On 161, they continue to discuss classism and specifically break it down into some class vernacular and terms that you might have used probably in other classes as well. The three that they use here are the owning class, which is the rich, the middle class, the middle working average person who can make a living even though they have 3 kids or something. And then, of course, the working class, or often referred to as the poor. One thing that they are quick to point out about these class positions is that they're not static, and that they do shift depending upon the time period and individuals' own ability within a generation of family to move out of a class. For instance, so class positions are very fluid. So for instance, if I'm looking at my own family's history and background, I would have said that my family was very much originally of the poorer class. And part of that is complicated because of the 1848 Treaty of Hidalgo Guadalupe and my great great grandparents, great, maybe it's three greats now, losing our land, and then suddenly went from owning or being able to work an area and make a living to suddenly working for someone else. And so for a long time, my family was working lower paid jobs, like in cannery facilities and factories and whatnot. But my family's class position has shifted over time thanks to my mother's ability to get a college degree. And so she moved a generation of our entire family into a more middle class position. And so now the types of jobs that my family and myself work are very much related to state employment or county employment jobs. And so it's fluid. You can move between these class positions. The authors explain the categories in even more depth, and they specifically break it down into 4 categories on page 162. The owning class, the middle class, the working class, and the poor. So in this kind of a breakdown, my family might have maybe been in between 2 of the classes. They might have sometimes been poor, but sometimes working class, depending upon whether they were able to have a type of blue collar living or employment or not. So they explain all those 4 categories, and then they go very quickly into the difference between capitalism and socialism. And these are terms that you will hear a lot. You hear a lot, especially regarding politics. And there's this notion that socialism is this really terrible, bad thing. How they describe it here is capitalism is the name given to the economic system by which resources and means of production and profits are privately held, for example, by corporations and shareholders, as opposed to jointly or publicly held. And this contrasts with socialism, which is the name given to the economic system by which resources are jointly held and profits shared. So in a capitalist structure, you can have a business like Amazon, which is extremely profitable, and one person is like the prime stakeholder of that company and is worth billions and billions of dollars, despite the fact that he has probably thousands of workers working for him that might be getting paid a minimum wage, who are actually the ones doing all of the heavy labor. And I've got to say that for a company that is worth so much money, they should be providing all of their employees dollies in order to carry heavy objects on it, so they're not hurting their own bodies and backs as they're trying to get products to people's homes, right? And so in capitalism, people would say, well, that's fair because he was the one who designed this concept and it was his creation, so he gets all of the profits. In socialism, the idea is that all people deserve a more equitable share in labor productions, and those who are working to, quote, at the more bottom levels are deserving as much credit and income as those at the higher levels. Another way they talk a little bit about this and give you some examples is they have in the little Gray boxes, keywords that they want you to notice the difference of, such as wealth versus income. And then down here, they highlight this sweatshops and what can result from more of a capitalist or individually profit-run business. So, for instance, we would say something like, oh, here in the US, we don't have sweatshops because we do have a minimum wage, and places of employment are required to have safe working conditions for their employees. However, if you notice on many of our tags of our clothing items or shoes or toys, you'll notice that products are made in other countries, such as China. And a lot of these countries do not have these kinds of laws to protect the workers. And so what is happening is that U.S. companies get around the legal laws here in the United States and do something called outsourcing with their factories. And they place their factories in countries in which the people have no protections as workers. And so they're able to keep production costs very low and have extremely high profits. They talked about some of these companies, including Mattel, who makes Barbies. They talk about Disney and Victoria's Secret and the amount of hours worked. And they have this really interesting pyramid of the capitalist system from 1911 image that there you go, that I highly advise you to look at and read closely. You can find a color version of this online. It's called, again, the Pyramid of Capitalist System. Then they go into class socialization, because even though class is about money and power, it is also about culture. So different class groups have different cultural norms and patterns that we associate with them. So the first section is school and class messages. Scholars have explained how mass public schooling is about more than subject matter education. It is also about ideological socialization and how children are schooled to conceptualize knowledge and the relationship to it. Then they look at media in class messages in terms of some of the larger media news giants, such as NBC, MSNBC, Walt Disney, Time Warner, CNN, CBS. So they talk about media consolidation as an issue around the globe. And then one of my favorite sections of this chapter, and I believe this is actually how they're going to end us. Well, this is a pretty long chapter. Yeah, they end with a lot of these misconceptions. So, common misconceptions about class. Things you might hear from friends, family members, even strangers online in comments under YouTube videos or on Facebook or Twitter. So they go through some of them. 1, we live in a classless society where anyone can make it, on page 167. So it's that age-old rags to riches story. America is about the country of opportunity. That's why so many people immigrate here. If my family made it, why can't your family make it? It's the American dream. So they try to explain how this rags to riches story overemphasizes the myth of the American dream, and that the vast majority of Americans, over 70%, cannot move between classes, and it's extremely difficult to do. And once you do, like if you're in one of those top 10 percentages, you are set generationally, because then your family and your family's family will continuously give you the best opportunities and the best schools and the best jobs. We can just look at the Trump administration and what is going on with his children and the positions that they now hold, thanks to the fact that their father was able to secure the presidency, right? Another misconception is a rich person can become poor as easily as a poor person can become rich. They talk about cultural capital here and net worth. Education is the key to getting ahead. And this is a really important one because of legacy scholarships and, of course, the scandal that we saw in which the wealthy are able to pay to have their children receive the best opportunities at Ivy League schools. So we know that people undermine even an educational system. They go through a whole bunch. Sports and sports scholarships offer minorities a way out. Class is the true oppression. If we eliminate classism, we will eliminate racism. And that is a really interesting discussion on page 169, because this notion of intersectionality, which they're going to get to after a couple more of these, misconceptions or misunderstandings. So consider this question 169 through 170 of class is the true oppression. And as you progress through more of these misconceptions, you're going to get to where it says understanding intersectionality on page 175. They describe it as the idea that identity cannot be fully understood via a single lens, such as gender, race, or class alone. They bring up Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the Black scholar who understood this term first and explained it in relation to the justice system and courts. I will provide an additional video about it on our Canvas class page. And it's important to note that the more positions a person inhabits within the spectrum of intersections, the more likely they are to become oppressed or to be vulnerable as a vulnerable population. So a white gay man has more privilege than a black, let's say, gay woman of color would have, who works a blue collar job. So there's different levels of oppression that are going on because of your intersections within these categories of difference. They go on to some everyday examples of class privilege on page 178. Common classist beliefs on page 178. And that lasts through the end of the chapter. And these are, they speak back to these misinformed statements. So this is really good. If you've ever heard someone say, immigrants are stealing our jobs, you might want to go to page 178 and 179 in the textbook to see how the authors explain what is really going on. Another one is poor people should stop having so many babies. It's easy when you get a government handout every month. And many of these are just false, they're inaccurate and uninformed. And then, of course, the authors take us back to the original story that they began with. It's a very deep and complicated chapter. Please reach out to me if you have questions as you are reading it. As always, I am available via email.